The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on negotiation and cost containment strategies for electronic resources. This is the fourth of 6 webinars in the Licensing Electronic Resources to Serve the Library's Mission series. I am Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is George Stachokis, the Electronic Resources Librarian at Auburn University. Previously, he served as Head of Resource Services and Special Assistant to the Dean for Project Management at Purdue University, an Electronic Resources Librarian at Indiana State University. George brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have him with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for the presenter, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and the presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here is George Stachokis. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. My name is George Stachokis, and I'm presenting negotiation and cost containment strategies. As mentioned, part 4 of our 6-part series, Licensing Electronic Resources to Serve the Library's Mission. Here's a photo of me, so you can see what I look like. And now for the next slide. Now, the challenge for libraries in negotiation and cost containment, the challenges are many. Electronic resources are rising in cost above the inflation rate. We have an increasing demand from research-intensive academic programs. You know, everything from nanotechnology to new allied health programs. I mean, there's a growth in disciplines and a growth in demand for library resources. We also have complex and shifting administrative priorities. So administrations across the country, they're competing for limited, funding to support their specific strategies for developing their academic programs to improve the services that they offer to students, and this also impacts libraries. And there are new demands for analytics and assessment. Just as higher education in general is suffering, a greater demand for accountability for all of the limited resources and how those are spent, that also impacts the library directly. And beyond all of this, we have flat or declining library materials budgets. So I think everyone on the call is familiar with the fact that the amount of money that libraries are assigned or are given to acquire databases, electronic books, and electronic journals just doesn't quite fit the demand. And then, to add further insult to injury, you have changes in the information marketplace. You have the ongoing impact of broader technological and social change on the expectations of library patrons. We have users who are digital natives. They're expecting the quick delivery of information resources in real time. They have a much broader range of demands than one could say of users 30 or 40 years ago, arguably. We also have new information resources, services, and other products and new business models. For example, evidence-based, DDA. We have a lot of different things to consider in terms of how libraries address these challenges. So that brings me to the important point of what can libraries do? Well, I believe that we can borrow a lot of useful techniques and strategies from the business world, the folks that are selling resources to us. For one thing, we can gather business intelligence. We can develop a strategy for engagement. We can negotiate. We can make assessment a routine part of our operations. And so in terms of gathering business intelligence, I'm really talking about gathering information proactively and systematically. And I think we really need to develop a strategy for engagement, with vendors that takes into account what the library is trying to do right now, what we're, hoping to do in the future, and just a better sense of the marketplace, and also, making a assessment routine. I'm going to, get into more of that in the other slides here. Now, having said that, even though there's a lot that we can borrow from the business world, being more systematic, being more proactive, gathering more information, developing strategies, we can never forget that libraries are not businesses and we face unique challenges. Libraries are, academic libraries, they serve academic institutions, not-for-profit organizations. Public libraries serve, the greater good, the community that they're assigned to. And beyond that, we have a lot of, practical challenges that businesses don't deal with. For example, we're confronting monopoly sellers, copyright holders, academic publishers. Usually a journal is provided by one publisher who holds copyright. That's not a typical business model. Most businesses are not facing monopoly sellers as a routine part of doing business. There are monopolies and oligopolies, but not as routinely as we encounter in the library world or the information world. And libraries have academic or not-for-profit organizational cultures. And that has an impact on how we do business with businesses, in that not everyone is up to speed, not everyone is familiar with how to control communications or how to manage engagement with vendors. So that has a lot of ramifications that folks aren't familiar with some of the best practices of the business world, as part of a matter of academic culture, and that's completely understandable. There's also just a limited knowledge of the practice of business among some key decision makers in libraries. Some folks may not be familiar with procurement and invoicing processes. Folks sometimes might not be familiar with all their state and local regulations that impact, doing business. And then libraries also have to face powerful stakeholders that are usually more powerful than they are. So, a lot of private businesses, they answer to, a board of directors, or they have, powerful, managers within their firm that guide their strategy and evaluate their effectiveness. But libraries have, depending upon what the library is and whom they serve, they have a lot of different stakeholders to take into account. Academic libraries have to consider the opinions of faculty and students. They have to also consider the opinion of alumni who may donate money to the library. These alumni might not have been tracking all the latest developments in science and technology and information that might impact library operations, but they're still going to have their opinions that need to be taken into consideration. Also, public libraries have, the public at large. They sometimes library issues can become political issues. For example, banned books, or some other phenomena that take place. So really, libraries, public and academic and special libraries, have a lot of different stakeholders that they have to take into consideration, much more so than many private businesses do. And now, in terms of how we go about, borrowing these, what's useful from businesses, we have to consider, first of all, gathering business intelligence. Understanding what we're about, understanding our environment, trying to get a sense of what we're trying to do. And so one of the first things to do is to understand our own users. And by users, I don't mean potential users. I don't mean users that might exist in the future or everyone's users. I'm really talking about the users at your own institution. If it's a public library, your own community, as it is right now. If it's an academic library, your own community, as it is right now. And understanding that community requires systematic gathering of qualitative information, quantitative information, and furthermore, analysis. For example, you want to gather demographic information. You want to get a sense from subject specialists in academic libraries. If it's a large academic library, what are the users of this resource? What are the research lines that are active? What are folks working on? What kind of grants are coming in and for what? Quantitative information that can be easier to gather in some ways. We need to systematically gather information from our research offices. Any type of demographic information that's published online about our user groups, we need to know what that is and make sure that finds its way to the libraries. In terms of analysis, we really need to take all of these different types of information that may be gathered by different personnel within the library and put it together and understand, so that we would be able to provide a synopsis if someone asked us, who are our users? What are the major trends that we can discern? What are our strengths and weaknesses? Where are the areas of emphasis in our users? And then once we understand who our users are, we can begin to understand what they need. And so that's a matter of identifying, current and future priorities. For example, if we know that there are a number of research programs that are growing with, say, 3D printing or additive manufacturing, we need to begin to assess what our additive manufacturing journals are and take a closer look at that. And we need to identify gaps in online access. based upon what these future and current needs, appear to be, we need to say, well, we're lacking this critical database, we're lacking these journals. And then we also need to begin from the get-go making a sense of potential sources. So even if a library is not able to afford a lot of resources right now, I think that gathering business intelligence systematically the way a business would means that we're proactive. Even if we know we can't afford something, perhaps we can't afford something for 2 or 3 years or longer. I mean, it really depends. We don't know what our funding is. We really need to have a sense of what we would do if the funding were available. So in terms of gathering information, this really requires a team effort. And, as I indicated earlier, this involves subject specialists, but it involves everyone in the library who can gather information that's relevant to what the library is doing in terms of collections. So, that would be, any type of information if you're an academic, if one's working at an academic library, anything from an academic office, current and programmatic needs. We need to get a sense of technological compatibility with tools. For example, this tool provided by Clarivate Analytics might be, something that would otherwise seem good, but it doesn't work with the IBM software that we have. We need to gather information systematically from information technology specialists and others to know what we really need. We also need to consider usability and the user experience. Let's say that there is an EBSCO host resource, and I'm just throwing out names of vendors. I don't want to get too specific, but I need to provide examples. It's otherwise a very good resource, but we've received a lot of feedback that the usability is poor for different reasons. A particular group of students, don't like it, or faculty don't like it. So we need to know these things. Also, gathering usage statistics systematically. We need to gather all of our counter usage statistics systematically, non-counter statistics, and any other type of statistics like Google Analytics that might be available. We also need to track very closely the financial resources of the library. Now, sometimes that information can be discreetly held by a few purposes, but if someone's working with vendors, they need to have, are planning, are doing collection analysis, they need to have access to this information as well. Now, in terms of gathering this information, as I just pointed out, it's really insufficient if it doesn't get to the right people. So if the library is doing all kinds of sophisticated collection analysis, gathering quantitative and qualitative information, talking to stakeholders, putting things together, we really can't have a situation in which those who are working directly with vendors, communicating directly with vendors on a routine basis, don't have access to this information. I'm one of these people, based on my own experience, where I don't really believe that it's sufficient that only the subject specialist knows something, or only the collection development officer knows something. Whoever is talking to the vendor, negotiating the contract, needs to have a full panoply of information. So basically, if you're negotiating a contract with ProQuest, you need to know how much your ProQuest resources have been used in the past year. Whoever is talking to the vendor needs to have studied this material and knows it, because usually the sales representative on the other end has studied this information if they're competent and if they're working for a major vendor. They have gathered a lot of information about us. We need to make sure we understand ourselves at least as well as they do. And I think that those who are working with vendors also need to have a sense of collection development priorities. This is not information that can be given to whoever is talking to vendors at the last minute. I think that folks are most effective when they understand the overall strategy. They don't need to necessarily share that with the vendor. They should be discreet about sharing this information. But if you know what your library is doing, if you know where your university is headed, then that enables you to negotiate on bits and pieces of things. One also has to understand technological needs, because again, there's an overlap between content and technology and usability. And so one needs to take all of these problems in tandem and not just assume that everything is on a commonly used platform. There are still a lot of resources out there that they may not have counter usage statistics. They may have a different format or an unusual interface. And so that all needs to be taken into consideration. Or they might have a business model that's increasingly anachronistic. There are a few journal providers that still have user limits or a limited number of simultaneous users. That's increasingly uncommon, but it still exists. And if you're talking directly to the vendors, you really need to know about the problems experienced by users, because it may come up in your discussions with the vendors. Usually the vendor representative knows what's going on, so do you as well. You can't really be siloed. You need to be plugged into the overall information that's gathered in terms of collection development. And gather information systematically about vendors. Vendors really know a great deal about us. You know, they look at the website of our university, or if it's a public library, they'll look at the website. They'll try to understand the demographics. They'll try to understand, you know, who we're serving. You know, they sometimes know more about our institution and our work than we do. You know, they really are private companies. You know, some of these are you know, multi-billion-dollar international firms. They really provide a great deal of back-end support that we never see for these individual sales representatives. So even if you have a very chummy, perhaps even folksy relationship with a vendor representative, there's a huge multinational corporation with all their information gathering capacity behind them. And in the library, we really need to kind of catch up a bit if we can. We can't duplicate all these efforts, but we need to be much more systematic about gathering information about these vendors, you know, reading financial reports, you know, studying what they're saying, trying to get a sense of what they think of us and what their objectives are. Like, for example, in my own negotiation with a major vendor, I found it very helpful to have read one of their reports about how their journal market was doing in terms of how they were making revenue off of their journal expenditures around the world. And also sometimes you can find out plans for a vendor acquiring a new society publisher or some other group. I mean, it's good to have as much information as possible. You need to know if a vendor is financially healthy, if, you know, for example, when their fiscal year occurs, because you might be able to negotiate a discount toward the end of their fiscal year as opposed to your own fiscal year. And you need to gather this information as systematically and completely as possible. Now, again, you don't need to discuss everything with the vendor. I mean, it's a judgment call whether you raise particular issues with them, but as just a matter of gathering intelligence, you need to have a good sense of every vendor as much as possible, who they are, what they sell, whether they're likely to merge or make other changes, and try to anticipate any potential opportunities for, you know, additional discounts or acquiring new content at a lower rate, you know, based on, again, their fiscal year or any other changes in the company, and understand, you know, your sales reps. Sometimes if sales reps are about to transition to a different role, you know, or do something else, sometimes, I mean, there are all kinds of different factors that can play into trying to pursue discounts or cost reductions with vendors. So in terms of developing a strategy, it's very important to get a sense of the overall budget and expenditure for electronic resources at your institution. You know, is the library paying too much for what it is already getting? And that requires, you know, analysis of subscriptions and continuations. You know, some folks have historically talked about 5% as a good annual subscription rate. But in terms of, you know, inflation, that's still considerably higher than the average rate of inflation. So one has to really see, how do I get these costs down? For example, I've been at some institutions where libraries have overinvested in single title subscriptions, and some of these are subject to almost random 20% cost increases, where if you have a package deal or quote unquote big deal, you can sometimes have a price cap at, you know, 3, 4, you know, 5%. You know, trying to get that down, that makes a lot more sense. So, and also analyze the one-time expenditures. Are you forgetting to leverage these one-time expenditures? For example, you know, you can work with vendors to reduce the cost of your journal subscriptions, sometimes by reminding them, well, hey, we spent $100,000 on ebooks this year, or we spent $200,000 on back files. Could you give us a cost reduction on our annual journal cost increase? You know, the vendor never forgets how much money you're spending with that vendor, so the library needs to keep track of all these incidents as well, not treat them as separate episodes or anecdotal information, but really put things together in a coherent whole and know what you're doing in terms of your spending with each vendor. Also, how might the library afford more of what it wants in the future? And you know, basically, this can be done in a variety of ways. You know, for example, conducting overlap analysis. That's available in a lot of, you know, A to Z list and you know, some ERM tools. Basically, get a sense of, well, you know, we're spending a lot of money on these journals, but they're not used very much. We could get this in a package, or, you know, could we replace this journal coverage with? Do we care about perpetual access? Could we replace this journal coverage with access-only full-text database? Or I've noticed that of these 3 databases, we could replace them with 2 databases that cover most of the full-text content at a lower rate with another vendor. I mean, be alert to these priorities and changes in usage and patterns. For example, you know, let's say you have a full-text database that has a number of textile journals, but then next year, you know, perhaps unexpectedly, your textile program is cut. You know, perhaps the rest of those journals are available in another resource, and you no longer have to worry about meeting the requirements of that textile program. So there are a lot of different things to consider in terms of investigating, the cancellation of lower priority items or changing priorities. And also, to some extent, and this is very difficult for libraries, you need to consider potential problems and pitfalls, because libraries have been living with flat and declining budgets for quite a number of years. The Great Recession in 2008 and beyond, it's been very difficult for libraries to plan and make adjustments. So one needs to really consider the worst possible scenarios and plan for that as well. Like, what do we do if we have to cancel something? Try not to overstretch. Try to limit potential risk, because again, you may encounter situations where you need to have a fallback strategy. If the library is carrying a certain amount of subscriptions, you can't guarantee that budget will be the same in the future. Now, in terms of negotiating better terms and prices, once you've kind of determined what your strategy is, once you have assessed what the need is, once you've got a sense of your goals at your own institution and the vendors that you might be dealing with, don't accept the status quo. Even if you think the answer might be no, a librarian needs to ask. One thing that kind of surprises me still is that when I'm talking to some vendors, a vendor, just a few months ago said to me, well, yes, we can offer a discount, but you're the first person to ask us. And I won't say who the vendor was, for the purposes of the webinar, but that surprised me. This is a major vendor, and for this particular resource, now again, I don't know if that's true. It may just be in that sales territory of that individual, but that kind of thing still bothers me and surprises me when I hear it, that we haven't asked for these discounts, that we haven't pursued alternatives, when it's really a matter of just trying to see what they can say. Again, they can say no, and we don't need to worry about whether they think we're foolish or silly or whatnot. I mean, again, we have to develop a good rapport with the vendor representatives if we can, but really trying to obtain better pricing and terms is something that we all need to try to do as much as we can. And some of the things, I have them listed on the slide here. We might be looking at a lower annual cost increase. One thing is that we, like I mentioned before, a lot of single title subscriptions or a lot of non-negotiated or non-licensed content, if we just accept a click-through or order through a jobber or a third-party provider, we just suffer these random cost increases. We shouldn't do that. We should try to make things predictable as possible if we know we're going to be subscribing to it. Multi-year agreements, that's commonly used, in the IT world and in libraries, and that's pretty well established. Now, one thing about the multi-year agreements is I try to often work holistically with a vendor. For example, if I have a multi-year agreement for journals, I try to work with them so that ebook purchases or other one-time expenditures are treated as amendments, which again can affect the pricing. For example, I negotiated one multi-year agreement, a multi-year base discount of 25% off for ebooks with a major vendor. And so for the 3 years of our journal agreement, we also have 25% off as our base price. That doesn't preclude further discounts beyond that 25% off adjusted base price. So that's the power of multi-year agreements. It creates more predictability for them and more predictability for you, and usually that's an economic value to them. And a discount on a new resource, remind them of what you're spending. Remind them of what you're doing with them already for other acquisitions, and sometimes you can get a discount that way. For example, with backfiles, if you hear of a deal where you buy 3 backfile packages and you get a discount rather than just one, remind them of the backfile package you might have bought last year and say, well, could you give us a bit of a break here on something like that? Also, renegotiate terms. Look at former subscriptions that are things you already have. For example, if you add a new resource and you have an existing multi-year agreement, that could be a chance to renegotiate the terms and maybe even knock off a half a percentage point or another slight decrease on that journal rate. And again, look at customized packages. We've been able to put that together at times. You just have to ask. Split payments across multiple fiscal years. I'm sure that some of you on the call have done this as well. Paying for multiple years in a subscription to obtain a discount. Now that can work in different ways. And also we can convert subscriptions into one-time expenditures. Now we haven't always been able to pursue all of these, but with some vendors I've had luck in turning potentially what could have been an expensive subscription into even a 5 or a 10-year subscription paid in advance, which can provide tremendous savings. And again, they're willing to do that because the money goes into their bank account right now. They're drawing interest on the funds that they've already received. Usually that's more than 1 year of a term, but it can still be a substantial discount for the library. And again, with hosting fees or one-time expenditures, you know, a lot of libraries, a lot of vendors will charge hosting fees for a database or some other resource. Try to see if you can either convert that to a one-time expenditure by trying to scale up a little bit by saying, well, okay, that's $500 a year. If we provided $2,000, could we eliminate this in perpetuity? Or you could just say, well, you know, if we're subscribing to a journal, could we have, you know, this fee essentially forgiven, or, you know, lumped together with one of our other resources? Or if we agree to purchase more than the one-time expenditures that you have suggested, you know, could we, you know, eliminate that fee? So these are different things that can be done. Now, in terms of cost containment, my case when I look at this is, again, we've already done a lot of analysis. We've already looked thoroughly at quantitative and qualitative information. We've already tried to get a sense of our institution, developed a strategy, consulted with subject specialists, consulted with other experts on campus about different, you know, collection needs within the library. And so really, even though cost per use and some of these other measures, if they're used unintelligently or without sufficient reflection and knowledge of you know, the precise situation or circumstances, the unit cost can be a very dumb way of looking at things. But if you've gathered all this information already and you have a sense that this is really what you want, unit cost can become decisive. You know, so basically we just need to acquire any content that we can at the lowest possible cost with the fewest possible restrictions on use. And one thing that concerns me about this is, I think some folks will look at these big deals and these packages and they'll obsess about the unused content within the packages. And I need to take a little time to discuss some of my concerns about this. Number one, I think the big deals still provide more access to content than just about any other option that's available to libraries usually. And most practitioners who've negotiated pretty good multi-year agreements where they either have substantial cost reductions or 2-3% annual cost increases, they will speak in favor of the big deals. There's a lot of literature and there's a lot of administrative concern about the big deal and how bad it is because of supposedly being bundled with unused content, but one really has to look at the unit cost. As Tom Sandville, the former chief negotiator at EResources, mentioned, if the unit cost, if the cost of the individual journals you want within the package is still lower than you can obtain those journals individually or from any other source, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the content is that's bundled with the journals that you want, because the journals that you want are so relatively less expensive than any other option. So when it comes to the unused titles and electronic resources as well, I think we need to think about the electronic resources that we don't want can be ignored. You know, we can manipulate metadata, we can manipulate discovery to some extent. If a journal is really something we don't want our users to see, we can hide it from them in a virtual sense with, you know, manipulating discovery and metadata. But, you know, if a journal is in a package, part of the reason why the vendors will put these big packages together is they have to pay at least small fees to publishers and societies that work with them. So for example, if you negotiate a deal with, say, an Elsevier or a Wiley or an Oxford University Press, they need to provide some type of royalty or licensing fee to the society that has given them the rights to their journal or is working with them as part of this larger journal package. And they can't do that if that journal is excluded from the package. But the beauty of this is, in a sense, for the library, is that if you negotiate a good contract with these major vendors, you can essentially, you know, pay a very, very small amount for this content, which is not going to be highly used or that you don't value that much. So really, it's a situation in which the vendor has to have some amount of money to supply to the other units that work with them to give them this big deal, but that can be a very small amount of money, and they will gratefully sometimes give you a bigger discount on the titles you do want if you'll take all of their package. So it's something to keep in mind. But again, the big deals don't always work. There can be situations where big deals should be broken up or large packages should be broken up. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. But when you do have the funding and you want a number of these titles and there isn't a cheaper way to get them, then the big deal is still a good option. Now, also, another way to think about these cost structures is to bundle things creatively. Like I've already mentioned, you know, thinking of ebooks and thinking of you know, databases one time and continuing subscriptions altogether. We really need to think about the total business that we do with any vendor. And again, they're thinking of that, you know, as well when they work with us. So for example, I have some examples of creative bundling. Now, One thing we can do, and that's more common, is if you have let's say you have a journal package, a multi-year agreement at 4%. If you know that you're going to be spending $200,000 on back files, and this might even be toward the end of your fiscal year, you could say that you want a reduction in the price cap to 3 or 3.25 or 3.5%. And again, I've also mentioned in the amendment where if you can't guarantee the amount of ebooks that you're going to purchase, or you don't know how much you're going to purchase, you can try to negotiate a benchmark discount where you'll say, we're committed to this multi-year agreement at 4%, but could you give us an amendment that would enable us to, acquire other content that you're selling or offering at a lower cost? So again, just kind of a reminder of some potential strategies in working with vendors on bundling. And again, don't be afraid to bundle things together. For example, if you're talking to a vendor representative about back files, and even if you're talking to another vendor representative from the same company, ask them if there's any way to get a combined discount if you're also going to talk about ebook collections or databases. Work with that vendor holistically, even if the vendor has a segmented or individual representative for different things of working with you. Sometimes it doesn't always work, but you can try to work with the vendors, as a whole, even if they're not set up that way. So now an example of seizing, opportunities, I think I go more into this slide with, different ways of trying to improve existing agreements. Basically that's a matter of adding more content if you can, but also having, tough conversations with vendors about your financial situation. Now, again, how much information you share with vendors really requires a bit of discretion. But I found success at times in negotiating 0% cost increases with vendors. I basically explained to them, we're in a situation where we've been, subscribing to your product for a long time, but basically we're going to have to cancel because we can't afford this rate. Our budget is truly flat, and we're looking at things where our money could go to something else. We're going to have to cancel something. If you can improve the business that you do with us, we can keep your resource rather than and cancel something else instead of canceling your database. Or you conversely say, well, this back file is listed for $8,000, and frankly, we have $4,000 to spend. Or you don't need to say how much you have to spend. You can say, we don't have enough. We don't have $8,000. How much money would you like to make with this? Because again, this money is going to be spent on something. We only have so much money. We don't have $8,000, but would you like to make some money from us this year? And again, I often find that if I remind vendors that procurement is a competitive environment and that we're working with other vendors, even if there are different products, that there is competition in the sense, even with monopoly providers, if let's say that we could buy a chemistry database instead of a physics database, we can simply remind them that yes, there are other options, there are the demands on our limited resources. Our dean, our administrator, whoever makes a decision may want to go with another provider if the terms are better. So that has sometimes worked where I've gotten 50% or greater discounts on back files by reminding them the money's going somewhere. Would you like the money to go to you? And I think for tips of working with vendors, I like to stay engaged with them on an individual level and really invest time. I like to hear about new products and services, so I try to have a positive rapport with them. I try to be interested in what they have to say. I mean, if possible, I try to develop a personal rapport, meeting with them, depending upon what your rules and restrictions are. This might be shared meals, this might be meeting for coffee. I sometimes invite them to visit here, or they invite themselves to visit here, or I work with them at conferences. And basically, even if I'm not interested in purchasing something, or we're not interested in purchasing something, I still give them a hearing, because again, they are obligated by their managers usually to inform folks about new products and share information, so it helps them to listen, but it also just keeps us informed in case the situation changes, and we can say, well, yes, we have heard of this, or we do know about this. It helps to stay informed. Also, with the vendors, I like to think in terms of developing a long-term positive business relationship between my institution and theirs. And so I try to frame a positive story about the library and the constituency that it serves. I try to draw them in and try to help them see things from our perspective to the extent that that's possible. Saying, obviously they need to make money, and I will assure them that perhaps unlike most librarians or not-for-profit folks, and again, this isn't true of everyone, I don't mind that they make a profit off of us as long as we can find mutually agreeable business arrangements that work for both parties. I understand that they're a for-profit and I'm working for a not-for-profit, but we can still work together and come up with things that work for everybody. And so I think in terms of framing that positive story, I try to think about what the strengths are of the institution that I serve. I try to tell them about exciting things that are going on. I try to make them feel like they're contributing to something greater than themselves at times by working with us and furthering higher education. I try to remind them that even though they're pursuing for profit, they're contributing to higher education, at least, indirectly. And, one thing though about talking about the library is you don't want to overshare about the library's finances. You don't need to say we have no money. You don't need to go into, great depth or detail about everything that goes on. It does require intelligent discretion. Again, you're framing a positive story. You're wanting to hear about their company. You're wanting to be positive in both directions. You want to appear interested in what they're doing. But in terms of sharing information, that always has to be handled discreetly, and you don't need to give unnecessary details because, again, in negotiations, you're always trying to get the lowest possible rate. You don't need to say that you're flush with cash. You don't need to say that you've gotten a huge budget increase. But again, if you've got negative information to share about the budget, you don't need to be specific, but you should let them know that you are under constraints, which again, most of them are used to hearing this, and they should have some preparations of dealing with it, and hopefully some discretion to provide discounts. And one thing that's more difficult, and this is true of any type of business relationship, you need to consider the long-term ramifications of any actions or decisions. These vendor representatives sometimes have individual negotiation discretion. Sometimes their managers do. So for example, you need to consider what you're doing. Like, for example, if you just told them that you need a discount on something, you don't want to go back to that same vendor and then turn around and buy something else with the money that you saved from that particular interaction. That's an obvious one. Which we may all forget at times, but I think in general, you need to consider what you say and what you do and try to keep a memory of it. And again, if you're not good at remembering your interaction with vendors and how you frame stories and how you talk to them, you might aim for shorter meetings. You might try to be more discreet. You might go for more listening. And again, your individual personality and strengths and weaknesses are going to govern how you handle these relationships. These are general tips that I'm providing that have worked for me for working with vendors. But based on your own individual personality, you're going to have to shape and develop that dialogue based upon what you're most comfortable doing and what your particular individual strengths are in negotiating with the vendors. And also it depends on what type of materials you're working with. In some areas like the humanities or social sciences or STEM, our special libraries, these can be quite different, and there can be a larger or smaller number of vendor representatives to work with and keep track of. Now, practical considerations, the negotiation process itself, once we've developed these relationships. Now, one thing I would make before I kind of run through the points on the slide is that my take on negotiation is that it begins as soon as the date of hire. That when you're negotiating with vendors, it's an ongoing, continuous process because it's rooted in a business relationship. So as far as I'm concerned, I started at Auburn on June the 1st, 2015. So June the 1st, 2015 is when my negotiations with major vendors started. I don't just look at the discrete episodes that occur for particular resources acquisitions. It's an ongoing business relationship, so it begins when I do. But again, if we're looking at these discrete episodes, just to be practical, we have to decide who is talking to the vendor about what. We kind of need to know that in advance, because again, libraries can slip out inopportune information. We need to kind of have a controlled communication so we can take advantage of opportunities as they arise that are unforeseen, but also prevent the vendor from having, too much information about some things or about letting them know about some things that are not appropriate for the work that we're doing. And again, we want to gather as much information as possible in advance, that long tail of preparation and analysis, which should take much more time than the negotiation process itself. We also want to have clear lines of communication. For example, should we be talking to our dean? Should we be talking to our associate dean? Who do we need to talk to as circumstances change and as terms change during the negotiations? Also, pick your battles and choose your ground. Be proactive in organizing meetings and choosing the time, location, and participants as much as possible. Do not surrender to the vendor's expectations or just to convenience. Figure out what you want to do and what works for the library. And also kind of decide on a rough timeline. But understand that achieving the best deal might require a great deal of time. I'm one of these people where I don't want to wait to the last minute on our end because I think the vendors generally have an advantage in outweighting us. They're the large corporations that have the deep pockets. We sometimes want to start early and have this dialogue early, and sometimes I find that I might want to revisit a deal a year or two later because we might get better terms. We might say, well, as that didn't work for us, and then come back later and try to get a better deal after not getting the best deal the first time. And of course, this is kind of like arguing a case in a law court in some ways. You need to build your case using the evidence and be ready to argue politely but firmly in the library's interest. You need to approach these vendors in a disciplined way, but hopefully friendly. Now, again, I like to talk quite a bit. I engage with the vendors in such a way that I actually find the process of working with them to be enjoyable. But again, we are trying to work together to achieve specific objectives, and we always need to keep that in mind, and we need to think about what we say and how that builds our case for what we need, not what the vendor needs. But one thing to remember is that the library world, all the vendor representatives, all the different libraries you interact with is very small, and you might need to get along with the same people for many years, including vendor representatives. So you never want to lie, you never want to deceive them. You want to argue your case, but you want to be careful in how you argue that case. Because again, you may be dealing with the same person, you may be dealing with the same person at another company. So never throw away one of these relationships or act in a way that's unprofessional. And in terms of further considerations about the negotiation process itself as discrete episodes, you want to manage the timing and pace of the discussions as much as possible. Understand that multiple interactions might be required to achieve the objectives you want. And again, like I mentioned before, you want to start those large-scale acquisitions early if possible. That's my general advice. Now, again, there might be specific cases or strategies where that's not the best option, but in most cases, I would rather start early than late. And again, one rule of thumb about interactions, now this doesn't always work in the library world, but sometimes among Wall Street negotiators, there's a rule of 5 where, I've heard some people say, and again, I don't know how common this is in the literature, but sometimes, for major negotiations, you might need 5 interactions. So plan accordingly. And whenever possible, like I mentioned before, you want to frame that discussion on your terms, not theirs. Instead of saying, can we have 40% off, you might say, well, we only have so much money, what can we do? Otherwise, it's going to be spent on something else, not what you're offering. Be polite and cordial, and most importantly, get it in writing. Make sure that whatever terms you've agreed to verbally, don't go on trust. You want to have positive business relationships, but you want whatever final terms are in writing. So it's very simple, but sometimes that's forgotten. The handshake is a friendly gesture, but that's not decisive. And you also want to be prepared to walk away from deals if it's not, sufficient or it might merit, further investigation. So, for example, if you're near the end of your fiscal year and you're not getting the terms you want and you think you might be able to afford something later, then be prepared to walk away from it and get a better deal next year. Okay, and in terms of assessment, in addition to that long tail of preparation before the negotiation process ever begins, assessment, iterative, recurring, never-ending assessment is critical to everything you're doing, because you need to constantly be determining, is what we've done, is what we've acquired, does it continue to work for us? Is it continuing to work in terms of cost, usage, usability, our collection development priorities, basically our programmatic priorities? Our university right now at Auburn is undergoing a lot of changes, and some academic programs are being reprioritized. So we need to take that into account. And we also need to take account technological compatibility. We don't want a resource, for example, and I'm just making this up, that would hypothetically only work on one type of device. We need to think about the big picture and think about how everything is working together. And finally, I think I would suggest, as I look at the situation with vendors, I have a few textbooks that are just general resources that I would suggest reading with one important caveat. So, for example, I have 6 titles here that I would suggest provide good insight into general negotiation processes and techniques for librarians. I included one book that I recently edited. It has one cost containment strategies chapter that goes into more detail about some particularly famous negotiations and processes, including some big deals and breaking up or developing big deals. But one book I wanted to kind of draw attention to is a book by Rosen, 99 Negotiating Strategies, Tips, Tactics, and Techniques Used by Wall Street's Toughest Dealmakers. Now, I include this book not because I necessarily think it's prescriptive or it indicates what librarians should be doing. It basically is a nice short primer of tactics that could be used against librarians. So I think to a limited extent, you could use some of the negotiating strategies in this book to the good effect for libraries, but it's more of a warning text in case some of these tactics are used against you, because again, libraries are a different environment. I don't think we need to take the same tactics or techniques as used by Wall Street, because it's a very different milieu to be working in. But nonetheless, there are sometimes some difficult negotiations where I've had some difficult interactions with vendors where they probably read or studied or kind of looked at things the way the author of this particular book does, and you need to understand how you might counter some of those techniques and strategies. And so that's why I draw attention to that particular book. It's a short title, but again, some of the other books, Libraries, Leadership, and Scholarly Communication, that by Rick Anderson, that's excellent. Beth Ashmore, Jill Grogg, the Librarian's Guide to Negotiation, highly recommended. And again, there are more recent text about the fundamentals of electronic resources management. So that's essentially, the presentation that I wanted to give. And at this point, I would like to take your questions and feedback. And I thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you, George. This has been a really interesting session, particularly as we all work with vendors and our electronic resource negotiations. We have had a couple questions come in. The first one was, what software is available, or what software do you use to do overlap analysis between the databases and between journal holdings?
Okay. Now, usually that's included in an A to Z list product, but not always. Now, right now we have EResources 360 Core, and that overlap analysis tool is included with that. We do not have the ERM module with EResources, so usually that's bundled with an A to Z list. But this might be a question that I might want to follow up with folks, afterward via email with more specific products. But really, Alma has overlap analysis capabilities. I believe it does. Alma replaces SFX, which is the former Ex Libris A to Z list, product. And again, I think they're with this transition from integrated library systems and electronic resource management systems to library service platforms. One of the problems we're encountering is it seems to be that, and this is understandable due to funding, that there's kind of a lag in development of different library services platforms and the transition, but the new library service platforms, like for example the Folio project, when the Folio system becomes available, at some point overlap analysis should be a part of that ERM functionality as well. But again, I don't have a more detailed update about that, even though I'm involved with that project. But I think that there are some commonly available tools. But then if you're not subscribing to one of those, there are some things in the pipeline that are being developed.
Great. And another question we have is, how do you balance the strategies you suggest to bundle and to tie yourself into deals with maintaining flexibility and being able to respond to changing circumstances at your institution? I know you talked about programmatic changes.
Yeah, this can be exceedingly difficult, and it really requires a lot of analysis and judgment. I think to some extent, if your university has been undergoing multiple rounds of budget cuts, or if you think that budget cuts are likely in the next 5-year period, say, then you might want to be more cautious about entering into some types of bundling and multi-year agreements. But I think one thing that's critical is financial hardship clauses, license language within the license agreements, so that if the library does suffer a commensurate budget cut, then it is able to get out of some of these multi-year agreements. So that's very important, the hardship clause. Legal protection, but I think it's really a judgment call that varies. And again, if for example, that your university is going to be strong in physics for the next 5 to 10 years, or it's very likely. And again, it's all these things are predictions or hypotheses. They're not proven, but to the extent that one can predict, one would say if your school is going to be strong in physics and likely to be so for the future, you keep investing in physics. You might bundle more in physics and do more multi-year agreements in physics. But if you think some of your other programs might be on the chopping block, then you might have to take a more reserved approach. And again, another thing is that when you have programmatic changes, you may need to take the opposite course of debundling and breaking things up, and then diverting resources to other subject areas or other goals. And that's never a bad thing. That's part of life, although it can be difficult and painful for everyone involved. But really, it just depends on how that user community is changing and what the resource base for supporting the library is.
Okay, I do want to remind our attendees that they can ask questions by typing them into the questions box. And then another question is, you talked a lot about internal communication and being sure that the negotiators have a lot of information at their hands. Do you have any tools that you use internally or methods to help that? I think that's one of the hardest parts, is a lot of different people work with different vendors or different parts of the process.
The short answer is, basically I rely a lot on, analog notes, as well as, Microsoft Excel and Word, and a lot of it, most of it right now is in my head. Now I'm wanting us to get away from that. Auburn University has had a limited materials budget for a while, and our money to invest in tools, we have some open source resources, but some tools that some folks use, they'll even use Trello, which sometimes is our project software, management software can be used. So I think this is another question where I want to follow up with the email about recommendations, but in terms of what I do personally, I'm able to keep a lot of information in my head just because I'm passionate about it and very interested, and I have a good memory. But I think in terms of tools, whatever you can use to gather that information. But I know that, for example, some subject specialists gather information more systematically than others, and if you can have access to that information as a negotiator, or at least what is the most useful synopsis or summary of that information, that would be helpful as well.
Great. Are there risks associated with paying in advance for a multi-year subscription? For example, what if the vendor goes under or switches hands? Can these risks be mitigated, and if so, how?
The short answer is yes, there are always risks. I think the risk can be mitigated by analysis, by trying to determine the financial health of the vendor if that information is publicly available. I think we've had some situations where we've had some major vendors go over, and that can go under, and that's very highly problematic. So one thing is I try to ask some of the major vendors, what do their acquisitions look like? Are they going to be investing in any new companies or resources? I mean, what's coming down the pike? So basically, part of the risk mitigation is to the extent that one is comfortable and it makes sense, to talk broadly and deeply with a wide variety of actors. Ask ProQuest, ask EBSCO, ask Wiley, ask Elsevier, ask Oxford, ask Cambridge. What are they up to? What are they doing? What do they plan to acquire? That can sometimes provide information or intelligence about what's going on with other seemingly unrelated companies, if that makes sense, especially the smaller ones that might be on the chopping block or the auction block, if you will. But I think in terms of mitigating risk, questions to ask vendors are, well, how many libraries subscribe to this resource right now? Have you had an increase or a decrease in subscriptions? You could say, well, just out of curiosity, how many I mean, you can be surprised at how much information they'll give you, and it doesn't hurt to ask.
Okay. One person wanted to know how much of the price negotiation is done by you, the electronic resources librarian, versus the subject selector. So what's your workflow there?
Okay, well, here at Auburn, I do all the negotiation. So,
okay.
So I handle all the negotiation myself, but that can vary by institution. So if it does vary, there needs to be an agreed upon division of labor and an understanding about common objectives. So again, now one caveat about that, like I said that I do in the negotiation, if something is extremely expensive or unusual, like for example, our Elsevier negotiations are handled partly at the dean level here at Auburn. And that's one resource because of it approaches several $1 million in spend, and that's why that's handled at a higher administrative level. But usually in my experience, I either handle all of it or it's scaled up, or I'm working with administrators on it. I usually don't, at Auburn, work with the subject selectors to negotiate. But again, I think in my experience, and again, I'm not speaking and saying what's necessarily the best practice because that can vary by institutions for lots of different reasons, people's personal abilities, institutional histories, different organizational cultures. So I'm not necessarily trying to be prescriptive here. But in my own experience, when an electronic resources librarian works with subject specialists, usually the best way that I've seen that is a subject specialist will address content and will talk to the vendor about content and functionality and usability, and the electronic resources librarian will also talk about those things, but then also negotiate pricing and talking about the ability to actually acquire something. That usually works better in my experience.
I think we have time for one more question. One person wanted to know, is there anything they should consider, particularly when they're working with a consortium? And I know that's very common.
Okay, now there is another webinar in this series that we've organized about consortia, so I want to put in a plug for the webinar about consortia.
Good answer.
But in terms of working with consortia, that is another complex business relationship, and to some extent, when you work with these other libraries, depending upon how the consortium is organized, there's also a political relationship. So you need to take into account more political and business factors than you might with just an institutional subscription. Consortia can be great to leverage and maximize deeper discounts. For example, Auburn University, and I believe this is public knowledge, we joined the Lyricist collection for Springer journals. Highly recommended. It's a good deal for that content as far as we're concerned. And I think it's an example of where we previously had subscribed as a single institution, but we found an expansion in content at a very good rate working with a major consortium. So really, libraries, I think a lot of libraries these days, they have an opt-in consortium. It's usually not the case at the state, or one is locked in with a group negotiation. But really, libraries need to weigh the cost and benefits of participating in a consortium on a particular resource, and then also invest in that option if it makes sense financially and politically.
And go see the webinar that's coming up.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I think that's it for our questions. I want to thank you, and I want to tell everybody that we're glad they could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable, and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. Thank you to our presenter, George Stachokis, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Wanda Jazieri, Aping Chen Gaffey, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. We have several more webinars this fall, including 2 more in the licensing electronic resources to serve the library's mission, and we have special collections cataloging for both monographs and manuscripts. See the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum starts on September 18th on The Right Stuff, Strategies and Tools for Staying on Track from Start to Finish. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.